Okay, getting back to nematoda, we've talked about them in general. You find them in just about every habitat you can imagine, in the oceans, in freshwater, in soils, on plants, and certainly as parasites. Plant parasites are a major problem for agriculture, although they can be beneficial as well because they can be used for controlling other pests. Animal parasites include parasites of certainly every vertebrate I can think of, probably a lot of invertebrates as well, certainly a lot of insects. Every animal of agricultural or veterinary concern, and quite a lot of others as well. Every wild animal that I know has nematode parasites, and humans certainly do as well. I'm not going to say that much about nematode classification or means of identification, but we currently divide the phylum Nematoda into two classes called the Chromadoria and Enoplia. A lot of this is based on DNA sequencing. The older classifications have been revised quite a bit. Most of the Enoplians are not parasitic. The parasitic members are in a subclass called Dorylema, and the Dorylema includes Mononcida and Dorylamida, which don't include any animal parasites at all, so we won't worry about them. Trichocephalida, also known as Trichinellida. Trichocephalida is newer. That includes two major parasites of humans, human whipworm and human trichina worm, as well as a lot of parasites of animals, a lot of carnivores and rodents, things your dog or cat could get. Dioctophymatida includes the kidney worm, which humans have been known to get in unfortunate circumstances, and animals sometimes get as well. Muspiceida is a small and obscure group that parasitizes things like Asian bats, if memory serves. So unless you're a rather specialized zoo vet, you're not likely to see muspiceids. They don't seem to be very well known. Myrmithids are parasites of insects, and those include some of the ones that are being used in biological control of pests. There are some that are very efficient parasites, I should probably say parasitoids, of mosquito larvae, for example. We won't get to them until Monday, but let's look at trichocephalids, because that includes a couple of major human parasites and a number of domestic animal species. Trichocephalida includes a lot of parasites of wildlife. This is one in the genus Capillaria that is mostly a wildlife parasite, but it's opportunistically capable of infecting humans. Not in North America, as far as I know. The reported cases that I'm aware of seem to have been reported from places like the Philippines. And normally they are not human parasites, but if you get them, they can be pretty serious. They cause a condition called capillariasis, hepatic capillariasis. These worms move into your liver and cause inflammation, allergic reactions, and a lot of scar tissue, and can cause pretty severe liver damage. In intestinal capillariasis, they burrow into the walls of your intestine and can also be pretty severe. Again, I haven't heard of cases in the United States. This is a tropical thing, and it seems to be pretty rare, but it is a possibility. There are species that could infect domestic and wild animals as well. Capillaria hepatica normally is hosted by rats. The adults burrow into the liver and stay there and lay their eggs there. What you're looking at is thin sections through infected liver tissue, and all of those oval-shaped things with darker insides nestled in and among the liver cells, that's eggs of Capillaria hepatica. What's odd is some of the eggs will pass out in feces and end up getting ingested by another rat. Others of those eggs will just sit there in the liver and they'll stay dormant until the rat either is eaten by a scavenger or dies and rots. If the rat dies and decays, the eggs go in the soil and may eventually find their way to another rat. If a scavenger eats the rat, the eggs pass right through the scavenger and they don't infect it. The eggs may need to be eaten by a scavenger in order to get passed on, but the eggs don't parasitize the scavenger. The eggs will pass out in the scavenger's feces. The eggs actually need oxygen. They have to develop outside the body. So it's only after passing through the scavenger's gut, a fox or something like that, that the eggs will actually become infective. So kind of an odd life cycle there, where the eggs need a scavenger to be passed on, but they don't actually infect it. I guess you could say that's a paratenic host. And because one of my pedagogical aims is to keep everyone thoroughly grossed out, this is the rat bladder threadworm, which does occasionally show up in domestic rats and exotic rodents kept as pets. I was reading a piece in a veterinary journal about a case of this that showed up in somebody's pet hooded rat. It's called Trichosomoides crassicaudata. On the left, you're looking at a diagram of a female. The head is at the upper right, coiling around towards the tail. Roughly 3/4 of the way down the tail, you can see the worm's vulva leading into her uterus. And there is a male worm snuggled up inside that uterus, going all the way up to her head. In this species, the male takes up residence and lives permanently inside the female's uterus. And you thought you had housemates that were tough to get rid of. On the right, you've got a photo of one of these. That's the posterior end of a female, and she's packed pretty much full of eggs. That's mostly what you see. But that dark gray arrow is pointing to a coiled up male living perfectly happily, to the extent we can measure happiness in a nematode, inside the female's uterus. Kind of a nice strategy. It certainly makes it, I guess, easier for females to find potential mates. I'm thinking there's some free-living invertebrates that have similar habits to that, where the male is actually parasitic on the female. Here, I don't know if the male is a parasite as such, but he just sits there and fertilizes her eggs, and I guess everything's great. Now we're getting into species that are relatively common in humans. The human whipworm is Trichuris trichura. You can see why it's called the whipworm. You've got kind of a blunt, thick handle and then a very long and thick whip part. That thick end is typically coiled in males, as you see on the right, and straighter in females, as you see on the left. That thick end is actually the tail. That always confuses me because the name Trichuris means bristly tail. So I always want to think that the narrow end is the tail and the blunt end, the thick end, is the head, but it's actually the reverse. The thick end is the tail. It's the anterior head end that's long and slender. So that's what they look like. That long and slender head end buries itself in the intestinal lining, leaving the thick end to stick out. And it's especially common in areas where feces are used as fertilizer. The eggs, we've seen this before, in particular, if you remember going back and looking at coccidia. A lot of those coccidian cysts actually need atmospheric oxygen to mature, so they have to pass out of the body and mature for a little while, a day or two, in order to be passed on. Here it's the same thing. Those eggs have to mature in soil for about 21 days before they can become infective. The eggs that pass out in the feces haven't even started cell division yet. They have to go through cell division and develop larvae inside before they're infective. And the usual cause is, if you're putting, your own feces as fertilizer on your soil, it's very organic and all that. But if you eat produce that's contaminated with feces that has eggs on here, you can get infected. And the latest estimate I've seen was that between 600 and 700 million people were infected with this worldwide. This is what this looks like on colonoscopy. The larvae hatch in the small intestine. They migrate to the cecum. That's the blind pouch where the small intestine meets the large intestine. Your appendix is a little extension of the cecum. The adults take up residence in the large intestine, and they thread those long, narrow anterior ends through your intestinal tissue with their swollen tail ends sticking out. So this is a couple of swollen tail ends of Trichuris sticking out of somebody's intestinal mucosa. This is what they look like on colonoscopy. I think this next picture might be a little bit gross, so brace yourselves. Yeah, this is the one. When the large intestine is infected, it gets inflamed. That causes diarrhea because the large intestine can't absorb water anymore. It's certainly painful. You get cramping and bloating. You can get anemia if you have loss of blood. And the wounds in your large intestinal lining can get secondarily infected with bacteria. In really severe cases like this, the intestinal tissues can be damaged and can swell up so much that you come down with rectal prolapse. This is your rectum turning itself inside out and extruding itself out of your body through your anus. This is not a great deal of fun. So yeah, that's a prolapsed rectum, and you can see the little tails of Trichuris whipworm sticking out of the inflamed rectal tissues that have been turned inside out. Yeah, sorry about that. I hope nobody was eating breakfast. Rectum? Damn near killed him. All right, punchline of a very old joke. There's related species that can infect dogs and cats. Trichuris vulpes can infect dogs. A former student of mine in this class, Nick Gentry, while he was taking the class, he was also working as an assistant at one of the local veterinary practices. I forget which. And of course, they do fecal examinations all the time. This was timed very well. Right in the middle of the class, he happened to do a fecal mount on a dog that actually has two different parasites. I'm not entirely sure what that oval one is up at the left, but down and to the right, that thing that looks like a football, that is canine whipworm, Trichuris vulpes. The eggs look very similar to human whipworm eggs. They've got that distinctive football shape, and you'll notice that the ends are translucent. Those are called the polar plugs, and they enable the embryonic worms to exit the shell. You might remember that some fluke eggs, like schistosoma, have a little operculum, a little trapdoor that pops open when the miracidium comes swimming out. This is kind of similar. It's a specialized structure to allow the juvenile worms to get out. So that's something that those of you who want to be vets might see. And we do have photographic evidence that you can find this in Arkansas. Little known cool archaeological fact: if you're eating lots of bone, especially if you're swallowing whole fish or something like that, your feces can end up containing lots of phosphate. If your feces contain lots of phosphate and they're buried in just the right circumstances, they can harden and they can actually preserve as fossils. You might know that fossil feces are called coprolite, and some of them can be quite old. There have been some interesting studies done on dinosaur coprolite, for example. You can get some interesting insights into dinosaur diet from looking at dinosaur coprolite. And this is a human coprolite in, oh, good grief, what's the year? I want to say 974. A Viking army invaded northern England and took the city of Eboracum, which they renamed Jorvik, and is now the city of York. And York, it turns out, has some very, very well-preserved remains of the old Viking settlement right under the streets of the modern city. And York was the target of pretty serious excavations for something like 10 years. And lots of artifacts from the Viking period have turned up. There were things like leather was preserved. So you have Viking shoes and purses and woodworking tools, bowls and plates and children's toys and things like that. Lots of stuff from York. And they also found Viking latrine pits. And analysis of the contents of the latrine pits revealed a great deal about what the Vikings used to eat, because seeds and things like that were preserved. And in some cases, you could actually find intact solidified Viking turds. So this is the largest human coprolite yet found, a whopping 8 inches long. I'm sure you really, really wanted to know that. They took samples of it, and they've taken samples of human fecal material preserved at other Viking-era sites, and we now have an explanation for why the Vikings were so mean. They were very heavily parasitized with whipworm. They had some other parasites as well. There's evidence of... I'm not sure what species, but I think they got tapeworms from eating fish. I think they had intestinal roundworm. Yeah, they did have Ascaris roundworm, which we'll talk about later. And they had whipworm. B and C, you've got 2 modern eggs. A right there is an egg that was recovered from the contents of a Viking-era latrine in Denmark, at a place called Viborg. And the eggs were actually preserved well enough that it was possible to get DNA out of them and confirm their identity and, try to work out where they might have come from. And it turns out this is not the only case where you can do this. Trichuris eggs have turned up at other medieval European sites. We know the Crusaders had them. They turned up in the latrines of a castle on the island of Cyprus that was built by the Crusaders. We know the ancient Greeks had them. We know the Romans had them. The Romans were very heavily parasitized. The Romans actually had a sewage system that was quite well developed. In fact, the old Roman sewer in the city of Rome is still in use in the modern city. The problem was that when the contents of the sewer got out of the city of Rome, the poop was dredged up by, I guess, very unfortunate slaves and spread on the farming fields around there, which did boost yields, but it also meant that all of the produce coming into the city was contaminated with Trichuris eggs. So yet another reason perhaps not to be too sad that you're not living in the glory days of ancient Rome, because you would have had human whipworm in your butt. They've even found them at a place called Çatalhöyük in Turkey, dating back to the year 7000 BC. Up at the top, that's human feces from Çatalhöyük. There at the bottom is what they found. Not as well preserved as the Viking ones, but you can see that very distinctive football shape with gaps at the ends where the polar plugs would have been. And this is probably not a coincidence, because Trichuris is transmitted by the use of feces for fertilizer, and Çatalhöyük is one of the first agricultural cities. Not necessarily the very first, but it's right about the time that some hunter-gatherers in what we now call the Fertile Crescent are thinking to themselves, hey, we can take these big tasty grass seeds and scatter them on soil, and maybe won't have to run around so much. This is about when agriculture is being invented, and wheat and barley are being domesticated for the first time. And right about where we see the rise of agriculture, we find whipworm eggs in people's feces, and that's probably not a coincidence. Right. I mentioned earlier that there's a hypothesis that the reason why we have so many autoimmune diseases is that the human immune system evolved to fend off parasites, and up until very recently, just about everybody would have had some. And moderate levels of parasite infection are tolerated, and your immune system is good at keeping them down. But when you take an immune system that evolved in that kind of dirty habitat and put it in a very clean one like we have now, with sewage treatment and food cooking and all of that, that the immune system is all geared up and doesn't have anything to fight, and so it can turn on the body. And you can end up with the immune system attacking the body's own tissues. I don't know the current status of that, and I certainly would not want anyone to take that as medical advice. But I did come across some clinical trials of the eggs of Trichuris suis, the pig whipworm. Trichuris suis does not live for long in humans. It doesn't cause chronic infection. I don't think we transmit it. And there was a case study in 2005 where they recruited patients with, I think, Crohn's disease. That's an autoimmune inflammation of the digestive system. And patients swallowed 2,500 Trichuris suis eggs every 2 weeks. The control group is, the y-axis is a measurement of severity of the symptoms. I think with 0 being the worst and 8 being the best. And the control group in the open squares, you can see how they weren't doing as well. And the experimental group in the dark circles actually did a little bit better. So there's some evidence that there might be something to this anti-parasite hypothesis of autoimmune disease. I certainly wouldn't call this definitive. And again, please do not take this as medical advice. I'm not the kind of doctor that actually does people any good, but it is something to ponder. So there. Okay, Trichinella is the other big one that infects humans in this group. It's the causative agent of trichinosis. And again, the head is the narrow end. The tail is in the upper part of this picture. If you look carefully, you can see the tail is absolutely stuffed full of eggs, this being a female. And like the whipworm, adults burrow into the mucosa, the epithelial tissue lining the inside of your digestive tract that has cells that secrete mucus, hence it's called mucosa. And they'll burrow into that. That's a cross-section through the gut lining of somebody that's infected. You can see that you're seeing a section through these little, very small finger-like projections on the inner walls of the intestine. They're called villi. So it's been a long time since I taught gross human anatomy. But if you've ever looked at the inside of a cadaver's intestine, if you get the fluid off of it, it actually looks a little bit velvety. And that's because the inside is lined with millions, I guess, of these little projections called villi that increase the surface area and help in absorption. And adult Trichinella lives inside the villi. If you look right at the center of this picture, you can see, this round thing with two darker spots inside. And then below it, there's a couple of other round things in cross-section. That's a slice through adult Trichinella, burrowed into the gut mucosa, living inside these villi, literally stringing themselves through one cell after another. They actually live inside multiple cells. Mild infections might not do very much, but heavy infections cause malabsorption syndrome. That's not a disease, that's a catch-all for all of the things that go wrong when your intestines are not absorbing food and water the way that they're supposed to. So you can get thinner, start wasting away, diarrhea, cramps, nausea, and vomiting result from heavy infections of Trichinella. The eggs hatch into larvae, but the eggs don't pass out in feces. What happens is that the larvae burrow out of the intestine and start migrating through the body. The name for this condition, by the way, and you'll see it again, is larva migrans, migrating larva. This is not the only species that does this, where you can have larvae crawling through your tissues. And of course, they do damage to any organ that they crawl through, including the heart, the brain, the lungs, or the kidneys. The larvae can also cause immune reactions. So you can get hives, you can get skin rashes, and you can get swelling in various regions, including the area around your eyes. So that's a trichinosis patient with swelling around his eye caused by an immune response to these Trichinella larvae. Where they end up is inside muscle cells. A larvae will penetrate a single muscle cell and coil up like this. You can see there's at least 4 and part of a 5th kind of oval-shaped lumps inside these muscle fibers with clearly visible coiled worms inside. These are the largest of intracellular parasites. And there's a whole bunch of them. Now, this is not really good for your muscles because it reduces the muscle's ability to contract and it reduces the muscle's power output. This can be fairly serious because for some reason, Trichinella really seems to like the diaphragm. Because you can get Trichinella from eating pork, pig diaphragms are not sold for meat and they're supposed to be disposed of at slaughter because that's the likeliest part of the pig. to contain Trichinella. Excuse me. All right. Now, cow diaphragms you can eat. In fact, if you've if you've ever had fajitas, you've probably eaten cow diaphragm. That's known as skirt steak. But pig diaphragm you must not eat because it's likeliest to have Trichinella. So there, you can see lots of them in there. This is what they look like in cross-section. The one on the right, that's been sliced at such an angle that you can see there's a coiled up worm in there. On the left, all of those circles are cuts through different parts of the body of a worm that's coiled up. So that's one worm on the left, but you're seeing multiple circular cross sections through the coiled up worm. And the larvae do these weird things. They alter the gene expression of the muscle cells that they're in. They become nurse cells, and they start producing vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, which causes capillaries to grow around the nurse cell and supply it with nutrients. So the Trichinella larvae inside the muscle cells can actually manipulate the host chemistry to gain a nutrient supply. They can increase their own nutrients by inducing the host to grow capillaries to the infected muscle cells, which is pretty weird. So, how do you avoid getting this? The larvae are transmitted to new hosts by eating infected meat. Unlike a lot of gut parasites, they don't pass through the fecal-oral route. The eggs don't pass out in feces. The eggs hatch in the intestine and then burrow their way out of the intestine and end up in the muscle. The commonest way for humans to get it is by eating pork. And humans can't transmit it except in cases of cannibalism. If you ate the flesh of somebody who had trichinosis and ate it raw or undercooked, you could get it. But since people don't usually do that, at least not around here, you're very unlikely to get it from one of your fellow humans. Which reminds me of the line about how a cannibal is someone who truly loves his fellow man, especially with gravy. Up at the top, by the way, you can see part of the life cycle is called the domestic cycle. And below, there's a different cycle called the sylvatic cycle. The domestic cycle is the most common way that humans can get this because it's transmitted among domestic pigs or between domestic pigs and rats. Rats will scavenge pig carcasses if they get the chance. Pigs will eat dead rats if they get the chance. And domestic pigs, especially if they're kept in cramped conditions like this, will actually eat each other. That's a dead pig starting to get eaten by his fellow live pigs. Ew, yeah. So the domestic cycle is Trichinella cycling among pigs and rats in farm settings or domestic settings. There you've got a wild boar scavenging the carcass of a dead bear. In the wild, it gets transmitted among bears, rats, wild boars, coyotes, foxes, and other scavengers, not in any particular order. Unlike flukes, where you have to go from, a snail to a fish to a fish-eating bird, or, a snail to a cow, or whatever it is, and you have to hit the host in a particular order. You don't have to in the case of Trichinella. Any one of these can get it from eating the flesh of any of the others. And this is called the sylvatic cycle, from the Latin word for forest, silva. And humans can occasionally catch this by eating undercooked game. I've never tried it, but I'm told that eating bear is considered a bad idea. Not that it's not good meat, but the meat of wild bears is very often infected with trichinella. So if you ever do eat bear, make sure you cook it very thoroughly. Wild boar is maybe a little bit more likely. People like to go hunting those. Apparently, there's at least one case of somebody eating undercooked raccoon and getting trichinella. So if you're eating raccoon for Thanksgiving, please make sure that you cook it thoroughly. If an infected animal isn't, or a human isn't eaten, the body will eventually precipitate calcium into trichinella cysts, and that will kill the trichinella worms, but this may take years. So here you've got a couple of trichinella cysts that are calcified, and the worm inside is dead or dying. And this happens to be how the parasites were discovered. James Paget was a physician in London who made a number of interesting discoveries. There's a disease you can get that causes, I think it's abnormal skull growth, that's still called Paget's disease. But he discovered while doing a dissection as a medical student that his scalpel kept going blunt. And it turned out there were these little gritty, like very small sand grain sized grit grains inside the cadaver's muscles. And there were enough of them that they were dulling his scalpel as he was making the cuts. And what those grains were was calcified trichinella cysts, as the person had evidently had very severe trichinosis in life. So, pretty good reason to, this is one of a number of reasons why we tend not to eat rare pork. It's been suggested that this is the real reason behind the prohibition of eating pig flesh to Jews and Muslims, is that it was originally a health regulation because there's a number of parasites that pigs get that can have a severe effect on humans as well. So yeah, if you're ever offered, a nice dish of, raw pork chops or something like that, you probably should eat something else. Okay, and I will stop recording and I will see you on Monday.